Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the latest edition of Bold Leaders in Learning. I'm your co-host, Brandon Busteed, Chief Partnership Officer at Kaplan, joined with a couple of my colleagues today, Kaitlin Dumont, who will be co-hosting with me today, and our good friend and colleague, Lucy Stonehill, who is the founder and CEO of BridgeU. So first of all, Lucy, thanks for joining us. I know it's a little bit of a time difference today. You're in London, I believe. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. Well, I know you travel frequently, so I'm hard pressed to keep up with where you are in the world. But in any event, we're excited to talk to you today about internationalization, global student mobility, and in particular, a bit of a deep dive on what U.S. colleges and universities should be knowing and thinking and doing as it relates to their internationalization strategy. So Kaitlin, I'll hand it off to you. I know you are excited to dive into the first question here with Lucy because you guys share a bit of background in a particular place.
We do. Thanks so much, Brandon, and thanks, Lucy, for joining us today. And yeah, like Brandon said, I was just so excited to chat with you as you went to Dartmouth, where I worked for a number of years. So we have common connections in Hanover, New Hampshire. But can you start by just sharing some more about your background with us, what sparked the idea for BridgeU, and kind of bring us up to present day?
Yeah, absolutely. Really pleased to be here with you both. So I guess I consider myself to be a kind of global person. In my world, we call, what happened to me moving around a lot as a kid and attending high schools and schooling more generally in different countries as being kind of a third culture kid, spending a good amount of your developmental years kind of with people from different backgrounds in different parts of the world. And you kind of gain this sort of blended identity as someone who sort of belongs in many places, but not in a single kind of location, which of course is a big part of the inspiration behind BridgeU and the students we serve. Quite specifically, as I was going through the post-secondary planning process in my last sort of 2-3 years of high school, it was an interesting time in large part because we were starting to see the early sort of footprint of ed tech starting to penetrate the classroom. I remember when we Blackboard was introduced, and it was kind of mind blowing that we suddenly then would upload our homework, using our laptops. And one of the things that struck me at that point in time was that one of the parts of a very critical part of the overall kind of duty of care of a high school is not just ensuring that students are learning the appropriate topics and subjects, but also that they then have a clear path or transition to their next step, which in my case and in most but in the cases of the students I was attending high school with was to look to progress on to higher education. And that sort of guidance sort of journey was, well, very opposite from the kind of early innovations we were seeing in the classroom. It was very old school, run by one or two individuals who'd been advising students for sort of 30, 40 years. And it sort of struck me as odd that this part of the kind of, again, the infrastructure of the high school seemed so sort of ad hoc in terms of the advice students were getting, what information they had access to, and otherwise how to kind of wrap their hands around this very daunting question of kind of what happens next, what's my next step, and how also might that next step position me for a career, beyond university. So I kind of went through that process, as we've already mentioned. I ended up at Dartmouth. And then on the back of my post-secondary experience at Dartmouth, I then graduated at the very tail end of the recession, which for those of us who kind of went through that period of time know that it was, also a very kind of jarring period for a young graduate who'd worked very hard at in my case, is luckily a top institution, and found myself really unequipped to enter the workforce, in large part because great jobs weren't available, but in many cases also because I didn't particularly know what to do with my skills or how translatable they were. So I think that kind of bookended experience to me got me really interested in this question of how we support young people with transitions between stages of education and into early employment. And a few years after I graduated, I had sort of ended up advising various families along the way about how they might help their child tackle this question of, where in the world might I consider progressing on to further education, higher education? What should I study? What is it like in the US versus the UK? And I realized that this problem space around the transition between high school into post-secondary education was one that was sort of shared quite universally. And so I plucked up the courage to kind of explore this problem more deeply, and realized that high schools themselves had a huge administrative burden around managing their own students' progression and pathways. And nowhere is that probably more true than in global or international schools, where advisors are having to support students considering not progression to one global destination, but in many cases 4, 5, or 6 key destinations. So I resonated with the problem, Kaitlin. I experienced the sort of bookend transition pains of entering college and graduating from college in a challenging environment. And then I just felt it was a problem space, given the challenges on the high school side, and given the sort of more interesting, perhaps, challenges around choice architecture that a 16, 17-year-old might be dealing with. I felt it was also a problem space that lent itself very well to technology as a kind of part of the overall solution.
So, Lucy, clearly your own experience was a major part of what led you down this direction. You're now about 8 years into the founding of BridgeU. BridgeU is now serving more than 100,000 students in 140 countries. Obviously, incredible impact and growth over that time. Tell us a little bit more about what BridgeU is doing, right? What the platform offers students and guidance counselors, and a little bit of the mission and your goals in terms of where you're headed.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a pretty stable mission since the beginning. We've sort of matured perhaps some of the framing or the language of that mission, but very broadly speaking, we believe that talent is equally distributed across the globe and opportunity is not. This is true across sort of multiple strands of talent pathways, but it's particularly true of access to kind of global quality higher education and opportunity. So to give you an example, 70% of the demand for international global higher education globally today comes from Asia and Africa, and yet 74% of the world's top 1,000 universities are in Europe, North America, and Oceania. So I frame that as part of the reason BridgeU exists in the way that we do, Brandon, which is that we serve and support global and international high schools, as you said, in 142 countries, and largely in emerging markets where the demand is greatest and the opportunity is not as available for many of those students, at least today, in those local markets. So how we frame that proposition is we partner with those high schools that themselves have they themselves have a mission to educate students and progress those children and those young learners onto the world's best higher education institutions. And we empower those high schools with, as you say, a platform, a set of supporting services, and a curriculum that is really framed around a global guidance process or a global college and career readiness paradigm. And that supports those high school counselors or teachers who are in charge of that process with the tooling, the sort of administrative elements of the platform that they need to really run a robust global guidance provision within their high schools. And conversely, students then progress on a 2 to 3 year journey where they're supported through various stages of that post-secondary decision-making process, from the early kind of career exploration, discovering who I am, what are my skills, interests, how might that prepare me again down the line for perhaps a career, and we plug in the gaps along the way to help personalize university, college, and course recommendations to that student cohort each year, again with a very kind of global orientation. And then there are multiple different parts to helping, of course, equip that student with the best possible levels of preparation to submit successful applications to their colleges of choice.
Thank you for sharing that, Lucy. It's such a critical and important mission, and we're seeing that disparity of access across the ed sector, but to really play it out on an international and global stage, it's such important work. I want to go back to something you said earlier about the original founding of BridgeU. You graduated at the tail end of the recession, and you decided to really dive into this problem and found your own startup. In our work at Kaplan, Brandon and I speak with ed tech founders regularly. What advice would you give to other aspiring founders, especially who are delving into their own problems of addressing these issues around access and equity?
It's a great question, Kaitlin, and I guess the first thing to say is that starting an ed tech company at the ripe old age of 25, 9 years ago, was a very different kind of time and context. Not least of which was investors didn't have that many examples of truly scalable global ed tech kind of companies that had proven out their business models and we're sort of justifying investment returns. That's a very, very different picture now. And of course, one of the accelerants we're all aware of is COVID, where 1.5 billion learners suddenly migrated online in a matter of months, and you have the largest experiment that the world's ever seen in sort of how resilient ed tech is. I think the critical thing for me there is a mindset shift from ed tech in many institutional contexts. So I'm talking K-12, higher education, and corporate learning, being seen as a nice to have to then being recognized as actually critical infrastructure to power learning and supported learning processes. So I'm jealous of founders who start now because I think they have a very powerful backdrop behind them. And they, of course, have the hard work of many, many companies who've gone on to prove that you can build fantastic, large, sustainable businesses in the sector. I think regardless of that, perseverance and resilience are absolutely key to the founder journey. I think, of course, in any job, in any field, in any company, there are ups and downs, but I think the magnitude of those peaks and troughs as a founder is greater. And so the emotional journey of that experience is probably feels more extreme. In some ways, I think that's a great thing for edtech founders because at the end of the day, you can kind of fall back on the why. Why are you doing this? And I think impact is the impact you can drive is obviously, I think, very visible in edtech and perhaps less visible in certain other industries or fields. And then I think the second thing I'd say is, I've partially because when I started the company, I didn't have too many obvious credentials that made me suitable to be an edtech founder, but I was also very young. And of course, I was female. Not a lot of venture capital dollars go to founding CEOs who are female. I think I was very humble in the early days. I like to think I'm still humble, but what that enabled me to do, I think, was invest in and surround myself with people who were better than me at each of the jobs I hired them for, with really no ego and no reticence about sort of delegating those key areas to those functional leaders. And I've been blessed with having a fantastic team that we continue to luckily be able to add to. So I think the quality of the people you surround yourself with every day has certainly been a very important part of our story.